Welcome to True Life's first, the word is escaping me, but the first video by online methods. I guess that makes me the inaugurator of it, and that's kind of a peculiar thought since I'm pretty anti-technology, but here we are, we're doing it. And of all things, my subject today is going to be science and faith, as you might be able to see over here. I have prepared slides with the idea that we're going to have two sessions, and frankly, I don't have all the slides for both sessions. My idea was that we were going to be in a place with people, and I was going to get interaction, and I like that. I like that a lot. And I do have 3 people in the audience, but they would like to remain anonymous. So I'm hoping that I can inspire at least a question or two from them. But if not, we'll rattle through these, and then we'll see what kind of response. Those of you out here who cared enough to look this up and find me, feel free to get on the phone. We have an old school messaging device, and you can say, hey, what about? You said, is that what you meant? Those kinds of things. And I've got another hour to hit this again next week. So thank you for being here. Let me pray, probably mostly for myself right now. Heavenly Father, I pray that right now that you, because you are God, you already knew how all this internet stuff works, that you come and you visit me and make me effective for what you would like to have said and done in this hour, in this place. Pray that you understand this far better than I do. You understand the times we are in far better than I do. And I just ask that you do your God thing with us, your people, and with anybody else who happens to stumble across this and is looking for an answer. I know as well as I'm sitting here, you are the answer. I just pray these things in your name. Amen. Small little editorial thing here to offer. We as Christians really should be in a position of being able to not freak out about empty store shelves. We really should be able to stay calm in these times. Our God said that he will provide all of our needs, and we don't need to panic about what's happening in our society right now. Either God's a liar or he'll provide. We got to take that seriously here. That's just editorial for what it's worth. I didn't ask Tim if I could say that, but now I've said it. Okay, to get to the question at hand here, we're talking about science and faith today. I'm talking about science and faith today because you can't talk to me. And this comes about, I think that this question has been riding in the church for, I don't know, since 1854 or so, when Charles Darwin came out with his proposition about evolution. And this is some of the things I've thought. This is where it's really good to have a crowd around, so that it's more like we're sitting around on a lawn on a Saturday afternoon with iced tea and eating burgers and talking about things. But here I just got to pick a line and go in one direction, and that's really, really hard for an ADHD guy like me. But I'm going to do the best I can with that. So here's what I prepared first. Just so you know about me, my actual background in terms of education, I took a BS in pastoral studies at Eugene Bible College. You will not find that college anymore on the internet, but what you will find is New Hope Christian College. That is the same school. It's in the same buildings, at the same address. It's still there. A guy by the name of Wayne Cadero is now the president of that school. He is an awesome guy. Back when I was in middle school, high school, Wayne Cadero was a youth pastor guy at one of the churches in Eugene, and that's where I grew up. So, for what it's worth, Eugene Bible College was, and this is for you who are parents of college-age students, I will tell you right now, Eugene Bible College, as a private Bible school, was the most academically rigorous school I ever attended. And you will notice that there's also Western Oregon and Oregon State University on the list there. Far more rigorous than those two schools. So if you are concerned about a quality education, and I don't mean Bible education, I mean education, you need to look at a private school, particularly a private Christian school, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, doesn't matter to me much. They're putting out a better product than the state does. Big surprise. Okay, I also based on the real world experience of a false start into the ministry, I decided I better get a degree from a school that people will recognize when I put it on an application. So I went to Western Oregon State College, which is now Western Oregon University, and I got my BS in elementary ed, which at the time was the best degree you could get if you wanted to become a middle school teacher, which is what I actually wanted as a career goal at that time, which, if you know anything about middle school, you know I had to be crazy to want that. And then 3 or 4 years into my time at the middle school, Colton Middle School, teaching, I got the opportunity to go to Oregon State University and get my master's. It was one of those deals where the first 2/3 of the degree were scholarshiped. That's the only time I ever went to school for free. And then to finish the degree, I had to do the last third out of my own pocket. And that worked out very nicely. So, yes, I'm sitting here in front of you as somebody with a Master's of Science teaching. That is not the same thing as a Master's of Science specifically, because it's about how to teach science. It's not necessarily the specifics of any particular area of science. So there it is. And then finally, probably most importantly, I'd spent 26 years teaching middle school at Colton Middle School here at Colton, Oregon. So those are the things that I have in my quiver to address the things I'm talking about today. So I started off with assumptions and biases. It is a fact, nobody can start talking unless they have some assumptions. And it is a fact that everybody has biases. And if you don't think you have a bias, it's because you're in the majority of whatever space you're sitting in. As soon as you're not in that majority, you'll know what your bias is. So that's how that works. And everybody makes assumptions. So I just want to tell you what mine are. So, first thing, Proverbs 27:17 is iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. I don't see in that verse an exception where it says only Christians can talk to Christians about stuff. I don't see a place in there where it says Christians are prohibited from talking to others about stuff. I see it saying one person sharpens another. And I will tell you that over the years I have been ground on by people that don't see the world the way I do. And I have had to concede they have points. They have things I have to consider. They have things that are true, and I have to do something with what they say. And I have spent some time thinking about it. So that's one of those assumptions. Next, Job 13:15a. I had to come to a decision, and this goes back to Eugene Bible College days, where I had to decide what to make of this phrase. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. The young man that brought this to me, he was a West Indian from Trinidad, and I'm not exaggerating, he was about this tall, very dark, nice beard, smart. Guy was smart. And he came back from going to Kenya because he was a part of the British Commonwealth, and he could go to Kenya for the summer without having to deal with passports and all that. So he came back from spending a summer in Kenya with this thought on his mind. Am I real with this? And can I take this for real? And he asked me to join him and a couple other brothers, and we got together once a week. And we worked on this question. Trust me, you are going to come to this point in your life. There will be something happen. And in my case, there's been more than one something happen. Whether I'm going to trust God, even if he decides to snuff me out right now. So, that's a really important, as you can tell, it's emotional for me because it's real. It was that same senior year of school when I had to decide whether I was going to believe in Christianity at all. I actually just quit going to class for a week. And I had to think that over. And I came to the conclusion that all the alternatives that I had heard about. And by the way, part of that academic background, I went to it seemed like every community college the state of Oregon has. I went to Lane Community College, I went to Portland Community College, went to Clackamas Community College eventually. I graduated from a public high school. I had been exposed to particularly the sciences to people who do not believe in God, find no need for God whatsoever to explain anything. In fact, creation as it exists is an argument against God, and they are persuasive people. They're not stupid. What their motives might be is on you to decide, but I had to engage with what they were saying, and I had to think about it, and I was thinking about it when I was 20, 21. Really had to think that through. So I've concluded that everyone's going to start from somewhere, and once they've done that assumption, they are going to shape their thinking. They're going to collect their information with that assumption in mind, and they are going to go there. I'm going to a place where even if God slays me, I'm going to trust him. And most of the time, I don't have to think about those implications. Right now is kind of a time to think about those implications all over again. So, let's move on past this slide now. Next one. Science is a way of seeking knowledge. Okay, that's just what it is. It's a way to seek knowledge. There are other ways to seek knowledge. Along the way, especially when you read science books, you can find some very interesting fellas that sought knowledge in lots of interesting ways. Particularly, I remember, now I can't remember the name of the scientist, but he was world famous, and he decided to go to the Amazon and partake in hallucinogenic and whatever other kinds of plants would send you into other spaces. And he sought knowledge, and he got knowledge, and it's real. So science is a specific way of seeking it. I don't know that you can read that, so I will read it to you. Science lends itself to specific steps for obtaining knowledge. If you're really going to do science correctly, you are going to follow very specific steps. By the way, generally the public has no clue what those steps are and doesn't care. They just want the label of science on it. They don't actually want to do the science. When you actually do the science, you don't always get the answer you want. But that's, all right. Science does not and cannot address vague questions. So what I mean by that is science can't prove that God exists. But science can't prove that God doesn't exist either. That's just not a science question. So you can't ask science to address that. It's just not a science question. Next, faith is not threatened by scientific inquiry. In fact, as you'll see a little later, many of the foundational scientists were, if not clergy, they were sincere, honest Christians in their time and day, in the churches that they belonged to in those days. And I'll have a couple of examples. But scientific inquiry is not threatened by faith either. These two have no conflict with each other. Now, I'll admit there are times when it seems to bring a conflict, and that's fine, and I'll tell you how I work my way around with that. So, moving on. So, as I said, science can't prove or disprove God's existence, and science can't prove or disprove God's actions. You can't say God did this or God didn't do this with a scientific experiment. You can't. But you can follow the scientific steps. Now, depending on which science teacher, and I have been in how many science teacher conferences, if you sit down in a room with 5 science teachers, and you say there's 5 steps to the scientific method, I guarantee you'll find one that says, no, there's 6, and then there's going to be another one that says, no, there's 7, and they'll get into a fight over it. Generally speaking, this is the scientific method. Okay? So number 1, you're going to make an observation. You're going to notice that something's happening. You just pay attention. Just notice. Things are happening all the time. A science-minded person is going to notice it. And it can be just simple things. Newton noticed an apple falling from the tree. Difference is, Newton seriously noticed it. Most people just, that apple's bruised. So, You gotta notice things. You gotta observe them. And then number 2, you have to ponder your observations. You have to think about what you've just seen. That's hard. Most people don't. Most people don't think about a lot of things. So it's hard to think about what you're observing. Number 3 is form a hypothesis. Most people go to this step really quickly. Now, and you can go from observation to form a hypothesis. Why don't you guys get chairs from off the... And you can get to a hypothesis really quick. Most of us do real quick. You watch a 2-year-old who's trying to entice the dog with a piece of food. You'll watch that kid make a hypothesis and then put it right into an experiment. Number 4, bam. Thought, hypothesis, experiment. Happens that fast. Click, click, click. So, to do a real scientific experiment, like a classroom thing that you're going to turn into the teacher and write up and use the format and all that, it takes more than that. But most of us people in the real world will go through those 4 steps real fast, real often, and not notice that we've done it. Locked your keys in the car. You very quickly get to a hypothesis, and then you start doing experiments. Anybody that's ever locked the keys in the car knows what I mean. So next, and maybe the last step is, most experiments you conduct will fail, because once you find your answer, once your experiment gives you the results you're looking for, you quit looking for the questions. You're done. So most scientific experiments fail. And they should. They should fail. That would be the very point behind a scientific experiment, is to find something that doesn't work so you can move to the next thing. I can tell you, going back to the days when I was at OSU, the first thing they did was set us up and made us really set out a scientific experiment. And this is one of those places where science teachers, every 10 years or so, they change the vocabulary, where you have to really have your constants figured out. You've got to figure out what your one and only variable is that you're working on in the experiment. And that's hard. I remember we were doing something with how tall bean vines would grow. And it is remarkably difficult to isolate everything except the one variable that you're trying to consider that would influence the height of bean vines. It is harder than it looks. And really doing a good scientific experiment is really hard work. So people that can are to be, they have a certain bent of mind. God gave them a gift for that. So let's move on. Probably had enough of this. All right. Next, this is highlighted in red. I don't know if you can tell, but it says God is truth. Please notice, those of you that are English people, how that statement works. God is truth. There's nothing about God that can't be true. Okay? And I'm going to John 14:6 with this. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, I think most people read the book of John and they're getting a little mystical with that. They're thinking about spiritual things. But I don't think I'm doing any violence to the text to say, if it's true, it's true. And if it's true, it's God. Which is why we see deception, is why we have such a fundamental reaction against being deceived. Because God is true. And we are built in His image, and we're about truth. And it really bothers us when somebody messes with truth for us. So, I would say also that anything true or real is a reflection of God's reality and existence. This is the kind of point where somebody might ask me a question, and we might go down a trail, but no one's here to ask that question, so I'll move on. Now, this is something I have to tip my hat to my son Ethan, although he's not the only one that could do this, and the screen is kind of warping this out of shape. But what I'm saying here is math is an example of God's truth. Now, those of you that despise math are looking at that and going, ah! Relax, we're not going to do any real math here. This is just a very simple linear equation. And I don't care what the domain and range is. I don't care whether it's a function or not. I don't care about any of that. I just wanted to point out that this is a way of describing something in reality. This line exists. You can put it on this piece of paper. You can draw it. It's true. Which, just for what it's worth, as long as we're teaching math in school, and we're teaching math in a way that gets you to the concept that there is one correct answer, then we'll always be teaching something true and accurate about God in our public schools. So, this is something I got from Western Oregon. I had gotten through. I decided I wanted to become a math teacher, but for middle school, and I'd gotten halfway through my calculus sequence at Clackamas, and I had to jump to Western. I mean, because my wife and I, we had this conversation. We have this much time to spend in school, and I was out of time to spend at the community college. It was time to transfer. So I transferred, and they said, "Oh, good news! If you want to be a middle school teacher, you have half the calculus sequence. You already have more math than you're ever going to need or use in middle school. Stop! But you do have to take this one more class called linear algebra." And I got some big ideas out of linear algebra. I would tell you, it won't necessarily show up today. It might show up next week. But I will tell you that in that linear algebra class, I learned some things about God that have been influencing my thinking ever since. Now, the man that taught the class was a pagan. Like, him and Aristotle would have got along great. He would have been more than happy to butcher a bull and throw the blood on rocks. He was a pagan. And he was smart. He was smart. And he taught me some stuff about math. And he taught me some stuff about infinity. And he taught me some stuff about the whole point of God. And he made this statement in a hot tub that doesn't sound so crazy. It wasn't anything weird going on. We were just sitting in the hot tub having a party. And he stated that language is the math is the language of the gods. And of course, all I did was capitalize the G and take off the S. There's no gods. There's one God, and math is one of his languages. And this is a true thing. So, as long as we're teaching math in public schools, we're teaching God's language to kids. They may not realize it. Schools certainly don't realize it, but it's there. Just because I love it. Another one. This is a math proof. Okay, it's a simple geometric proof, and the idea here is that, and this is logic. And again, we stopped teaching this. Well, my father graduated high school in 1960, and he was taught Latin and logic in high school. I graduated in 1981, never heard the two concepts ever, okay? So, I don't care about this construction, although I think it's kind of cool. But if you're going to have a real logical argument, not in an emotional sense, but you're going to compare, you're going to take some things, you're going to talk to someone else, and you're going to come to a conclusion about what true thing is here, this is the way you do it. First of all, you have to know what's given. If you don't agree on what's given, you've got nowhere to go and all day to get there. And that's where our society is in many ways right now. We no longer agree on the givens at all. We're willing to kill each other over the givens, but we won't agree on what they are. Okay? So, there's a couple givens. And then there's the demand, at least in this geometric thing, and what you have to prove. In this case, you're going to prove that AB is parallel to CD. There's details I'm going to get on that. Now, you set this up in a T-chart. Here's some statements. This is what you, the student, have to produce. It comes out of your head. I'm going to say that, okay, I'm going to start with my given, and then I'm going to give you the reason why I can use that. Well, I'm going to use the given because you gave it to me. Good. Everybody can agree on that. Next, you're going to say this stuff here. And here you're going to go back to your textbook, because before you can even get asked to do this, you were told some definitions. That's another crucial thing if you're going to have a truly reasonable, intellectual argument, is you have got to agree on what the definitions are. Again, our society has completely abandoned the concept of having common definitions. We use whatever is handy to our argument at the time. I don't want to do that. I'm telling you what my definitions are. Then you're going to go along through here, and you just keep going down, step by step, giving why you're making each statement, what you're basing that on, and then you get down to, in this one I couldn't find one that said it. It used to be that you would write QED, what your conclusion is. QED was short for a Latin phrase, which since I never got taught Latin, I can't tell you what it was. But that was, ta-da, I'm done. I've proven it. I actually did that on a couple of finals and midterms at Western in a Euclidean geometry class, which also just accidentally taught me some stuff about God too, like how we are so woefully, and this was, we as a culture have abandoned logic. We don't do logic anymore. We say we do. We love to put on the clothing of logic in our internet arguments and whatnot, but we don't use logic. We use emotion. We use political advantage. We don't use logic. Okay, move on. Let's see. Oh, hey, I can turn a page. Are you feeling better? Okay, here we go. All right, moving on. Assumptions and bias. Let's see. Okay, this is a little bit, I actually I tried to copy this from a previous slide, so I already said this, that Jesus, in John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Anything that's real is a reflection of God's reality. And this is why I put this next line. I wanted to come back and circle back to this, because there are times when I do find doubt. I don't know how to respond to the heathen who says, what about? And I don't have an answer for, what about? And I have learned to just wait. Just wait. Just wait. God is not slow in providing answers. But his timeline, remember, he's infinite. His timeline makes no sense to human beings a lot of the time. I don't have... There are times when people, some pagan or unbeliever of some stripe, will somehow catch a hold of some factoid out of the Bible, and they'll say, see, this proves this is a bunch of hooey. This is scientifically incorrect. And I have learned to just wait. Just wait. Wait for other people to hear the statement. Like wait for some thinking to occur amongst human beings. And sooner or later, somebody's going to come up with this is the answer. The idea that there's a story in the Old Testament about the sun moving backwards in the sky. Oh, it can't happen. It's scientifically impossible. I agree. It's scientifically impossible for the entire cosmos to stop and reverse motion. Impossible. I do know that there's this thing called retrograde motion, so that from our point on Earth, when we look up in the sky, there's periods of time when the planets appear to be moving backwards. Yeah, but that doesn't apply to the sun. Wait. Just wait. Wait. We human beings, I as a Christian man, whether I can answer that charge today or not, I'm willing to wait. I'm willing to wait and see what God eventually provides for that answer, for you or me or anybody else. This isn't particularly scientific, but I can tell you that in my life, when I have waited on God for whatever the question is, instead of getting my tail in a yank and deciding to do it my own way, God never fails to provide his answer. But it's hard. It's really hard to do that. It's really hard to do that. And I'm not telling you it's not. Okay, moving on. Next, Jeremiah 17:9. Man's heart is wicked. And I mean, this man's heart is wicked. And that means that he will default to an anti-God conclusion. If you leave men to their own thinking, if you leave Jesus out of the question, they will always go to a nasty conclusion. Something that's anti-God, something that ends up hurting other people. They'll always sin. Will always do the wrong thing at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. That's what people do when they're left to their own devices. That's what Adam did. That's what we do. Next, Proverbs 25:2. I didn't understand this. The first time I read this phrase, I think as I remember, I was like 12 or 13 years old. I was reading a paraphrase of the Bible called The Way for the first time from cover to cover, and I came to this verse, It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter, and I just didn't get it. I don't know that if I really understand it to this day, but I look at that phrase and I look at the world that we're living in, this created world, and there is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of things to understand in our world. And it glorifies God that it's that complicated. And it doesn't matter how high you go off the face of the planet, or how low you go, or the last page of The Incredible Shrinking Man, that kind of dime novel book from the 50s. The main character gets to the step where he's standing on this he's been shrinking and he's been shrinking and he's been shrinking, and he gets to this place where he sees this stairway, this that just goes and goes, and he realizes that he's standing on a leaf and he's stepping up the cells of that plant, and it gets through his head that he's never going to shrink to the point of disappearance. It's never going to happen. There's always going to be something else down there. So we got the atom. Electrons, neutrons, protons. Oh, you gotta figure it out there. How many protons are in it? You know what? That's not even the hard part. The hard part is the quarks that are the subatomic particles. And when we get past that, there's going to be something below that too. There really is. There's always going to be something else there. So when science comes out, look, we've proven the next thing. It's like, well, a little late to the party. Of course there's more. God's infinite. This is his creation. Duh! There's always more. Come on. I don't know why God set it up this way, but it's God's glory to conceal that. It's our glory, or King's glory, to figure it out. I don't know why, but God set it up that way. And there's a lot of people that groove on that. I got 4 smart kids that groove on figuring it out. You get frustrated. And you can't laugh at them when they're frustrated. It's not fair. Anyway, okay, so that, all right. Next, I don't think people realize this either. As a school teacher, this made me kind of irritated. I really hated this one. It's highlighted in yellow. I don't know if you can see it. It says, all scientific knowledge is provisional. It means it's all kind of on hold. It's all temporary. I don't care what you think you know. There will come a point when science might change its mind. A really easy example, you remember the 7 levels of classification that Linnaeus came up with back in the 1600s, kingdom, phylum, on down to genus, species, okay. That's an excellent way to organize things. But since the 1950s, when we discovered DNA, we're discovering that isn't really, there's problems with that taxonomic system. The binomial nomenclature, that's the fancy thing for species, genus name for every living thing in the world. It's very handy. We still use it. It's a very useful way for us to communicate with each other, regardless of our native languages and whatnot. But when we start getting down to the genetic level of things, we're discovering that the system is kind of breaking down. It kind of doesn't work for us. We have to come up with a new organizing system, and we haven't done it yet. So scientific knowledge is, by its nature, meant to change. As we add more to our knowledge, it affects what we know and it changes what we know. And there's times when as a teacher, you get your favorite lessons and you want to teach this, but you know what? They just found out at Stanford that this is how it really is. And now, oh man, so something's got to go out so that something new can come in. That is science. Science is always breaking down or challenging assumptions. That's one of the things about science, is that it's supposed to be challenging things. And to be very honest, right now in the modern Western world, one of the scientific problems is we aren't challenging assumptions the way we should, the way we could. Quick example, gravity is constant, true? No, gravity's not constant. Now, we have a number in a textbook printed that says it's 9.8, and I forget what the units is, but we have that as a gravitational constant, and for the purposes of figuring out whether this water tower is going to stand, it's fine to use that as an assumption. It works. But if you really are honest with your science, gravity's not always equal, not in all places, on the surface of Earth. Now, we know that gravity's not equal between Earth and Moon. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about right here on the face of the planet. Gravity doesn't stay constant. The variations are so small, you and I'll never pick it up. But it does vary. And science doesn't want to admit that. I'm not really sure why. I don't know what that would challenge. But so, okay. All right, finally, okay, this might be the last thing I talk about. And it's certainly not the last thing that I was ready to talk about. But I'm just looking at the clock and knowing that you might be tired of listening to me. So, and I'll tell you right now, students in Colton have been hearing me do this little diatribe for years. And I have a suspicion those of you who might be former students are going to go, oh my, I can't believe he's saying that. Okay, but it goes like this. Scientific laws and scientific theories are different. Theories cannot become laws. Scientific theories cannot become a scientific law. Here's the example I like to talk about. There is this thing called gravity, as I was just referring to. Now, at Colton Middle School, they built a one-story building, 2 stories tall. I'm not sure what the theory was behind that, but that's what they did. So, I would offer to my students, let's all check out this thing. I got this theory that gravity isn't in effect today. So let's go up to the peak over the walkway here, and let's step off the peak of the building. Let's do that. And they all go, no! Right. Why? Well, because you got all the gravity's happening. That's why. Nobody's going to be stupid enough to step off the edge of the building. Right. I agree. You're correct. I get it. Now, explain to me why that would be true. Why do you know that stepping off the building, you're going to end up breaking both legs and probably your whole body on the cement walkway below? Well, prior experience, observation. Sure, okay. But explain to me why that's what happens. Infants old enough to crawl, when you put a sheet of glass between 2 tables and leave open space between, that you will not get a baby to crawl across that. We human beings, we know about gravity. We're born with this innateness. Don't step into open space. You don't do that. Fine. Explain to me why you know that. See, the explanation for why we don't want to step off the edge of the building, that's our theory. And we might have a theory that is dead on, perfect, exactly as God created it to be. Great. But what we haven't done is we haven't done anything to disprove the law. Scientific laws exist because God made them. They're there. Scientific laws are just there. If you want to break a scientific law, if you want to break the law of gravity, go ahead. But understand that you're the one that's going to get broken. The law isn't going to get broken at all. You can't even bend the law. Not a scientific law, you can't. You can't bend it. Okay, so when I go, hey, what about flight? Correct. Okay, thank you. So what you're doing there is you're invoking one law over another. You're invoking at least the Bernoulli effect in order to talk about how wind going over the top of the wing creates low pressure on the, it allows, but you got to be moving fast enough for that to happen. And so yeah, you can get some things to change for a period of time. But you tell me, when you're done burning your fuel, where's the plane going? What law is going to come back into force now? Now that you're done with your 800 gallons of fuel, you're done with being able to invoke the Bernoulli effect on your airplane. Which law comes back and reminds you that it never went away and it ain't going away? Law of gravity. It doesn't even matter if you can explain it. I don't care if you have a theory of gravity, which there is, by the way. Right now, I didn't bother to look that up. I should have done that just because it would have been interesting. But anyway, the theory of gravity is immaterial to what I'm saying. I don't care what your theory is. I don't care if you think Menahunis are out there carrying you to keep you from falling down. I don't care about that theory. What I care about is the law. Because a scientific law is God's law. He made it. If we can explain it accurately, cool. You're rather smart. But you don't have to. You don't have to explain a scientific law. You just have to obey it. And if you don't, it'll break you in one form or another. Okay? So, I've got to kind of think about here. Okay. Now, I asked, I'll show you the next slide. So, oh boy, time. I'll rattle through this quickly. So, this is, I referred to this earlier. It'd be nice to close this off. So, scientific thinking was and is a shift away from magical thinking into towards law-based thinking. And I looked at Psalm 119. You just read that whole psalm. It's about God's law over and over again. Again, it's a psalm. It's a spiritual book. We tend to think that it's always about spiritual things. True enough. That doesn't change anything about the physical world. God has laws there too. And a wise man obeys them. The fool breaks them and ends up breaking himself. So, I'm not sure how to say his first name. Pascal, he lived from 1623 to 1662. And I go back to those really early days when science was just starting to kick off. Because really, people thought in magical ways in those days. They really thought that they wouldn't necessarily use the word magic to describe things, but they just thought sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. We don't. It's good luck, it's good fortune, it's whatever. Well, they would invoke God's will if they were coming from a Christianized point of view, but it was a magical way of thinking. You never knew what was going to happen for sure. You just kind of hope for the best. Where scientific thinking, law-based thinking, scripturally accurate thinking inspired people to start saying, I think there's a pattern here. I think there's a way things work. And I think I can figure out what it is. And if I can figure out what it is, I can stay within the law and quit getting broken. So this guy, Pascal, he was absolutely a Christian, and he was contemporaneous with René Descartes. Back that slide that showed that line on the grid, Descartes' the guy that figured that out for the first time. Interestingly, he never drew a grid. He had to have a pal do that for him. But he's the one that, he just assumed the grid was there. And there's a story that he was laying in bed sick, because he was kind of a sickly dude, and he's looking at a ceiling that had been built out of squares, perfect squares, and he was watching a fly crawl across the ceiling, and that's what inspired his thoughts about that. René Descartes himself, heavily influenced by Christian thought, based his contributions to science on 3 dreams he believed came from God. And I got this from famouscientist.org. And I also used Encyclopedia Britannica. It wasn't deep research, but it's stuff that's readily available to you if you want to go check it out. Another guy named Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691. He's the one that did Boyle's Law. If you are a person that uses a hydraulic cylinder or pneumatic tools, you are using Robert Boyle's laws. That your tools are based on his laws. So, and he gets the name for it because he's the first guy that figured it out and published it in a way that gave him credit. Of course, it's God's law. I already said that. Anyway, and notice how far back this is by our standards. It's a long time ago. But in terms of human history, this is new stuff. Most of history, people were not thinking this way and understanding the world in this format, the way we do these days. So he was a devout and pious Anglican, and I thought it was interesting because, again, this is Encyclopedia Britannica. I thought it was interesting that he used the word pious. In modern church circles, people of piety, that's not necessarily a compliment. It should be, but not necessarily. It kind of invokes an image of the grandma that needs to drink some prune juice. It's just not a real positive thing. But in those days, devoutness and piety It was a good thing. It was a great thing. It tells you that the guy was a real Christian in his day. So, an Anglican, I don't know what your background is. That's kind of like Catholicism, only the priest can get married. And it goes back to King Henry the church politics and why church and state and why we don't do it that way here in America. All right, we're close to being done. And finally, many early scientists were educated first to become clergy for one church or another, including Charles Darwin. This was extremely true in England. England has a state church. To this day, the Queen of England is the head of the Church of England. And as a result of that, they had a lot of upper crust families in England would send their younger boys, because the way it worked in England, the inheritance laws, the first son got it all and everybody else was root hard to die. So they would often send their younger sons to seminaries, or whatever they called them in those days, and they would train them as clergy. What's interesting about that is you didn't have to believe in Jesus, you just had to be rich. And you'd go off and become a clergyman for the Church of England. And very often, more than once, you would send this guy, who actually may not be a believer at all, to some local parish, and he had not much to do because the people realized he didn't really care about God, and so he started tinkering around with science stuff. Now, that's also true, as we can see from the first three, that there were some serious Christians working on this. By the way, Isaac Newton is a really good example of this. He was a clergyman his entire life because he was part of the church structure in England. And now I'm just shooting from the hip with what I can remember about him. He's famous for coming to doubt the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay. But he's also famous for coming up with the three theories of thermodynamics, the laws of thermodynamics, and he's famous for the falling apple and all that stuff. He's famous for having invented or co-invented complicated algebra. What's it called? Next level up. I did half of it.
Calculus?
Calculus, thank you. He's the guy that invented how to do that. Okay? So, I can believe. I've talked as long as I budgeted myself to do. It's been about 45 minutes. I'm ready to quit talking. My next thing, and two of you guys responded to me saying that we wanted to talk about some aspects of evolution, and that is my next slide. But we're going to stop here because it's just crazy if we don't. Thank you for your time. I ask, seriously, if there's something about this that has, and you know me well enough to know my phone number, please give me a call, leave a message, we can talk about it. If I've irritated you, I'm sorry. If there's something you want to hear me address next week, that's great. But I am going to be wading into questions of evolution and genetics and DNA. And I know already that's a wider and deeper thing that I'm going to get done in 45 minutes. So you're going to get what I got, and I'd love it to start a conversation. So let's have a quick word of prayer, and you guys can go on, whatever you're going to do next. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this opportunity. I pray that you can minister this to the people who hear it with the intention that I have, that there's grace and there's love and there's mercy and there's kindness, that this doesn't become part of the ongoing, I don't believe anything that the Christians say, or I don't believe anything anybody says if they're not a Christian. That we stop with that we find the place that you are the God of all, and that we just need to recognize that and bend our knee to you. I pray that you bless, I pray that you provide, I pray that you calm the hearts of your people in this time and in this way. I pray for health for everyone that comes into contact with this particular little episode. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior, I pray.